We are very pleased to welcome Dr. Mower Provost as an Associate Professor in Computer Science and Engineering here at U of M. She received her PhD in Electrical Engineering from USC Los Angeles in 2010, has been awarded the prestigious National Science Foundation Career Award, an NSF Graduate Research Fellowship, Herbert Kunsel Engineering Fellowship, the Intel Research Fellowship, Achievement Award for College Sciences Awards, and the Oscar Stern Award for Depression Research in 2015. Her research interests are in human-centered speech and video processing, multimodal interfaces design, and speech-based assistive technology, and the goals of her research are motivated by the complexities of the perception and expression of human behavior. So thank you again for coming here today, especially after teaching, and welcome.
Should I be wearing the microphone? Should I wear the microphone?
From a recording standpoint.
No, it doesn't affect the recording, and
I'm
it's
also
pretty
going to do a
obvious.
model.
Okay, cool. If anyone would like me to, I'll just put it on so no one has to ask. Does it make it different acoustically?
I don't think we've ever used it.
Well then,
Because there's no place to hook it.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I promise I'll tell you if we can't hear.
Perfect, perfect. I promise to try to avoid that. Okay, so the goal of our work is thinking about how we can use human-centered computing to understand behavior. And the reason I find myself personally motivated by this is that not only from an algorithmic side is this a really interesting question, but it means that anytime we have our algorithms working well, our technology doing what it's supposed to be doing, it means we've enabled science. We get to learn a little bit more about human behavior by creating technology that works. And so today I'm going to do something a little different than what I normally do. Normally I like to talk about all of our algorithms in their gory detail, talk about the results. But I think that actually misses out on a lot of important information, which is how do you actually get large scale in the wild, that's a term that we use to mean not in a lab, data collections to actually work. And the reason why I think it's important to do so, to talk about things this way, is that it took us about 7 years to figure this out. And so what I'm going to be doing is kind of presenting an overview of where we've come from, why we started there, and then how we got to where we are now. And so I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about the underlying algorithms, but I think actually the journey, the how, is actually what makes this so interesting. So it used to be when I was just starting that there were always questions about why is it important to have effective or sort of emotion computing in engineering. I haven't had that in a long time because I think people generally understand now that automated agents are everywhere. If you want your car to recognize that you are fatigued, that's looking at behavior. If you wanted to understand that maybe road rage is starting to emerge, that's behavior. There are so many aspects of our behavior that allow us to think about how technology can operate safely. But it's also relevant for a human-robot interaction, where you might want to have a robot that interacts seamlessly with you. Well, if you wanted to do that, it needs to know more than what you're doing. It also needs to know how you're doing. So again, effective computing. And one of the grand challenges from the National Institutes of Health is thinking about how you can allow people to actually age in place, age in their house. But if you want to do that, you need to know more than what someone's doing. You need to know how they're doing. You need to know if depression severity is increasing. You need to know if cognitive decline is on the rise. You need to know all of this information, but one of the great things about human behavior is that it tells you. And so algorithms that allow you to recognize behavior accurately have a huge area of application across all of these spaces. And it's also really hard, as it turns out, because when we start talking about behavior, especially when we talk about behavior not in a lab, there is so much that goes into how we express ourselves. So sorry, I'm going to point over here, so sorry to move away. When we think about speech, it's not just emotion, it's not just mood, it's not just road rage, it's our lexical content. What we're saying is going to influence the underlying signal. It's our environment, because where I am is definitely going to shape what I'm willing to say and how I express my behaviors. It's also personality differences, thinking about how people who are extroverts produce their emotion versus people who are introverts. All of this will shape, in addition to emotion, which might actually be the thing that we're interested in measuring. And so the trick, the challenge, the opportunity in modeling speech is really trying to figure out how to capture the aspects of behavior that you care about while controlling for the incredible amount of variability that's natural in the signal. And so this is what we do. We focus on sort of two major areas. One is in audiovisual emotion recognition or emotion modeling. There what we're trying to do is understand things like perception. How are people integrating information when they're making emotional decisions? Helps us guide the design of our algorithms. Expression modeling, how does a group of people perceive a given display, and how can we make our algorithms do something that's similar to what people are doing? And when we think about this, much like many people, we think about deep learning, multitask learning, transfer learning, many of these approaches. And although often deep learning gets a little bit of a knock sometimes for the amount of hype that it's attracted, but the thing to remember is that these types of technologies have enabled so much in speech recognition, in behavior modeling that was never possible previously. It was never possible before you can harness the power of big data, the power of transferability, the power of incredible amounts of complexity. And so it's a very exciting time to be in the area. We also do a lot of work in assistive technology. And our goal there is to think about how we can use speech behavior to understand something that has to do with the health side. So it might have to do with speech tracking for individuals with aphasia. It was one of our early projects looking at language loss due to stroke and how you can model this from speech. We're interested in mood tracking for people with bipolar disorder, thinking about how oncoming mood episodes might change the signatures of speech. We would look at estimating suicidality and also doing speech assessment for people with Huntington's or Parkinson's. And in general, our motivating question is, how do changes in speech inform our understanding of health? And so here I'm going to talk about our work in bipolar disorder and also in expression modeling. And it's funny, when I first started, these two topics used to be wholly disconnected, but now actually it's the connection between them that allows us to do things that matter, which is really exciting. But first, just to ground in terms of terms that I might use a bunch, our goal is to detect human behavior from speech. When I'm talking about emotion, I mean one particular way of talking about emotion, because emotion can mean many things to many people. I specifically mean recognizing how positive versus negative an emotion expression is, emotion behavior is, and how calm versus excited. I'd be happy to take questions about why we specifically talk about emotion that way afterwards. But that's always what I mean. When I'm talking about mood, I'm often talking about a clinical definition, something like depression or suicidality. And although I won't be talking about it here, when we're talking about diagnosis, we're talking about something like Huntington's disease or aphasia. In all cases, though, our goal is to start with some kind of conversational behavior and extract out the signal that we care about. So in this case, our conversation might be collected nicely in a lab with a microphone very close to the face. Unfortunately, it's not the type of data we often work with. It's beautiful if it was. Often we extract out the speech signal, and then we try to estimate something that we care about. Maybe it's valence, positive, negative, activation, calm versus excited. So we're going from some kind of time continuous signal, usually to some other kind of time continuous estimate. But the reason why I feel so motivated to work on this, particularly the reason why I felt so motivated to work on a problem that's taken 7 years to make much headway, is this idea of linking algorithms with impact. Because there's so many interesting algorithmic problems to work on. There's so many different ways that variability comes into so many manners of expression. But I personally feel very motivated by knowing that when we have things that are working, we are allowing people to have more control over their mental health. Or we're providing families with a way of understanding emerging risk of suicide. Or we're enabling ways of understanding treatment so that we can have a better sense of treatment efficacy. All of these things are the link between algorithms and impact. But the one I'll be talking about initially is bipolar disorder. It's a leading cause of disability worldwide, and it's a common, chronic, and severe. And although we often culturally talk about bipolar disorder in a very trivial way by saying I had a good day and a bad day and a good day, it's not what bipolar disorder is. It's characterized by swings of depression or very lowered energy and mania or extremely heightened energy. And those swings can have dire consequences. There's increase in the amount of suicide, but there are also personal, social, and vocational consequences. And in fact, researchers showed that up to 2 years after suffering a manic episode, about 40% of people are still not back to their pre-mania functioning level. And so it's critical that we find some way of trying to mitigate the effect of this disorder. And there definitely are ways currently. There's pharmaceutical treatments, although they're not functional for everybody. And it sometimes takes a while actually to realize the treatments that will work for a given individual, and it might change over time. There are also periodic follow-up visits with a clinician, and this might be to enable monitoring, but at least according to our collaborator, these are both costly, and the majority of them are actually unnecessary because people are generally staying healthy. There are also reactively, after a manic or depressive episode, people might be hospitalized. But in that case, the devastating consequences have already occurred. And so what's needed is some other way to try to anticipate that changes are afoot before they happen so that the consequences can be averted. And this is the motivation behind this idea of wellness monitoring, are thinking about how you can control the swings between depression and mania to allow someone to stay at a more stable baseline. And because we're close to Detroit, we use the check engine light analogy, because if we can detect these check engine lights, then what we can do is bring people into a clinical environment and avert these consequences. Keep the symptoms to be more minimized so that when people are going about their daily life, they don't have these huge swings into depression and mania. It's the overarching goal. Now, our goal is trying to think about how we can automatically quantify an individual's warning signs. And these are the goal that we started with when we first began. Now, as we went throughout, we started to think a little bit more about how you actually implement this, because as it turns out, that problem is very, very, very challenging. And so we changed it to thinking about how we can augment algorithm design with clinical knowledge. And our engineering challenge, as I kind of hinted at the beginning, is thinking about how you can control for variability in the context of doing this kind of mood state recognition. So that's our overarching goal. Now, before we talk about any of the specifics, I kind of want to provide a roadmap for where we are, where we've come from. So we had a set of papers that came out that's looking at how we can recognize mood in this population. Excuse me one second. And in this case, we started, as people so often do, with a relatively controlled corpus. I say relatively controlled because they were clinical interactions, but they were clinical interactions over the phone. Now, this meant that from a clinical perspective, we knew what the topic was, we knew that it was surrounding mood, and we knew the questions that were being asked. We also knew that it was a clinical interview, which is helpful. But it also still had complexity, because it wasn't recorded in a lab with a microphone right next to somebody's mouth. It was recorded from cell phones, and I'll talk more about our collection as we go. And so we still had some degree of flexibility when we were thinking about the type of variability that would be present in our data. And so we started off in 2014. You might notice 2014, 2016, there's a 2-year gap, never what you're hoping for in publications. And then 2016, 2018, oh no, another gap, I'll talk about that. And then within the last 6 months to a year, we had this huge breakthrough where we started to think about how we can incorporate other types of modeling, how we can use speech recognition, how we can better leverage the power of deep learning to really be able to do things in natural speech. And that includes understanding language differences. So how do the patterns of language change when someone is in a clinical versus someone is in a personal environment? They're very different. What about estimating the risk of suicide? How can we understand how suicide risk could be estimated from naturally collected smartphone data sets? And finally, how can we predict intervention? Because sometimes it's not enough to just say that the symptom severity is higher. You might also need to say, and I should do something. And so one of our recent papers that's in submission now has looked at how you can automatically predict the need for intervention using unstructured speech data. What I'll be talking about is the orange pipeline. Going from our initial paper, a speech rhythm, personalization, emotion, down to predicting risk of suicide. And I'll be talking a little bit about also the technologies that we use to do this. These two, the language differences and risk of suicide, were actually just published mid last month, and it was in an interesting location. And the next predicting intervention is in submission and will be coming out shortly, hopefully. So first, what kind of data do we actually have? So we have an unusual type of data. We have data collected from smartphones. And it's part of the Priority Project, which is predicting individual outcomes for rapid intervention. Now, the way this project worked is we gave everybody a study smartphone. And on their study smartphone was an app that collected their side of every single call they made or received while using our study smartphone, which lasted for about 6 months to a year. They were fully consented, and just to be very clear, we take everyone's privacy extremely seriously and consider our participants to be our research collaborators. So the app wrote in the background, and in fact, the only time you can mostly tell, there's a little black M in the corner, which would mean that the app was working. And people really only interacted with the app if they wanted to delete calls, because people have a choice of whether or not calls actually get uploaded to our servers or not. We actually don't keep track of whether or not they're deleting. Once they were on our servers, we would then do feature extraction. The feature extraction is extracting short-time measurements from the speech that we would use to then associate with patterns in mood, or eventually also patterns in emotion and risk of suicide. We would extract these from the underlying waveforms. And then finally, our goal is to predict either increases of severity or increases in the need for interventions, really trying to figure out how you can trigger just-in-time interventions from these natural speech data sets. And it's allowed us to collect quite a large amount of data that we talk about in a very specific way. So the first term I'll use a lot, is personal calls. Personal calls are calls that someone makes as they go throughout their day. They're randomly distributed over the course of the day. They could be any length, they could be about any topic, they could be with anybody, we have no idea. They're just purely natural speech, someone just using their smartphone. We also have assessment calls. The assessment calls are our clinical interactions between our participant and his or her study clinician. And in these calls, we assess level of depression with the Hamilton Depression Scale and level of mania with the Young Mania Rating Scale. And these will perform our ground truths. These are the things that we're trying to predict. We generally group our calls by assessment calls, so a group of personal calls are associated with the closest assessment call in time. Our participants include 51 individuals with bipolar disorder. Actually, this is a study set that we've been using for quite a long time, but we have about 100 participants total now, and 9 healthy controls. At the time of when we stopped augmenting our data set, we've started augmenting again. Our data set included about 50,000 calls and over 4,000 hours of speech. Now we're up to about 5,000 hours of speech. And our question was, how can we estimate mood given this information? And I should say, so my background is in emotion recognition, and when I started this project back in 2013, our first publication was 2014, so when we started in 2013, I had the emotion recognition mindset, which was, you take the data, you extract measurements, you predict the thing that you were trying to predict. And that was not a very good mindset. And it was not a very good mindset for a really interesting reason. And that really interesting reason is that's not how people work. People aren't depressed. They're not manic. They have different levels of severity, but even quantifying that severity can be very, very challenging. And so this whole notion of labels, the reason why algorithms can work so well in machine learning doesn't necessarily apply to this domain, which took me, to be honest, about 6 months of conversations, not of sitting by myself, literally of conversations to understand. And so the first thing we did start was actually, as I said, very similar to emotion recognition. Our goal was to take the data that we received either in the clinical assessment calls or the personal speech and extract short-time measurements, the things we call features, and associate those with labels. We created labels of depression and mania by just having endpoints on the scale. So if you're below a certain point, you were considered euthymic or healthy, and above, you were considered to be in a manic state or in a depressed state. And our goal was to map from these low-level acoustics to these high-level properties. And we were really excited because our first population set, it just worked really well. And we were like, great, we're gonna solve this immediately. No big deal. Like 1 year, we will have solved this problem. As it turns out, that wasn't true. And 2 years later, we published our next paper. Because as we got more and more people and we realized the diversity with respect to how people just converse naturally and also how people express their symptom severity, we realized these extremely simple approaches wouldn't work. And so we went back to our clinicians and said, okay, the idea that we had that we can do the simple mapping in an emotion recognition sense from features to labels isn't really working very well. How else can we think about augmenting how we're considering these problems? How else can we model these data? And so what our clinicians told us and had been telling us was that one of the ways you can really differentiate between a healthy state and either a depressed or a manic state is by considering the rhythm with which someone speaks. When someone is in a depressed state, their speech slows. When someone's in a manic state, their speech becomes more pressured. And so we said, well, fabulous. And so we looked at signal-derived measures of speech rhythm and started to use variations in the rhythm as a way of predicting whether or not someone would be considered to be in a depressed or a manic episode. And so we did this. We started with the audio signal, and then we did device compensation. Now, again, we're doing data collection in the wild. We only had 2 phone models, the Samsung Galaxy S3, the Samsung Galaxy S5. That is the same model family. Oh, the microphone, wildly different, and I'll talk about what happens when you don't do device compensation in a second. We then did speech segmentation. Fun fact, clinical assessment call. I'll get back to that in a second, but it matters dramatically for thinking that you found something when you did not actually. We then estimated speech rhythm, and then finally did support vector machine classification. The first part was pre-processing. We used something called R-bar declipping. That's a way of trying to correct for the fact that our microphone in the Samsung Galaxy S3 was overly sensitive, and instead of having speech that looks like this, we had speech that looked like this, which introduces an amazing amount of high-frequency noise. We then used an algorithm called ComboSat. It's a speech activity detection algorithm to partition out speech and silence. We did feature extraction, and then classification either with single or multitask models. So the first thing that we did, the first thing literally that we did, was try this pipeline without doing device compensation, because somehow we had not yet realized how different these two microphones were. And we came up with the ever-inspiring results of chance performance for Mania. We were using area under the receiver operating curve. 0.5 is chance. Look at that standard deviation. That is not statistically different from chance. That is never the first result you're hoping for. That says, ooh, maybe you've chosen a wrong problem. We persisted. Depression was looking more promising at 0.64. And it's kind of interesting. So at the beginning, or maybe a few minutes ago, I was talking about when someone's in a manic episode, they have pressured speech. Guess what gets reflected in the speech? When you have pressured speech, you also have a lot of clipping. And so there's actually the big problem with the Samsung Galaxy S3s is that you had a lot of clipping when people were in manic episodes, but in the Samsung Galaxy S5s, it wasn't true. The patterns weren't consistent. But yeah.
What is clipping?
Oh, clipping is when instead of having a signal that looks like this, the microphone is overly sensitive, so it crops the signal here. And so you have something that looks like this. And the abrupt changes cause extremely high frequency noise. And so it makes it extremely hard to recognize the underlying signals. So the first thing we did was correct for that. And we actually found that in the case of mania, we actually had statistically significant improvements, which made sense, not in the case of depression again, because in the case of mania is when we were actually seeing clipping taking place. It's where you had pressured speech, it's where you had more of this effect. And so we felt very inspired. But then we really wanted to understand, okay, so what is the impact of segmentation? Again, segmentation is the process of removing speech and silence. And the reason why we were interested in this is that we found that when we had a better segmentation algorithm, strangely what happened was the performance of our classifiers went down. Now that's not a particularly expected finding. Usually you'd expect if your pre-processing gets better, your modeling gets better. And so we took it to the extreme and said, fine, we just won't do segmentation, what happens? And we had statistically significant improvement for both mania and depression. And so we went to our collaborators and said, oh my gosh, we just found this really interesting and kind of counterintuitive finding, that when we keep silence in our signal, we can do statistically significantly better job in predicting symptom severity. Isn't that interesting? And they were like, no, that's not interesting. They were like, okay, tell us more. So they reminded us that in a clinical interview, what you have is a clinician talking to a patient. When you have one side of a clinical interview, what you have is lots of silence and an answer. Lots of silence and an answer. Now, those answers are short when someone is healthy, and they're long when someone's symptomatic. And so if you're keeping silence in when you're calculating your statistics of these features, then what you're doing is capturing the structure of a clinical assessment call. When someone is healthy, they have short answers. When someone is unhealthy, they have longer answers. That's not a property of speech, that's a property of a clinical interview. And so it really reinforced, and there are other things periodically that also reinforce this, that you really, when you start working with unconstrained data, and this is, it's still kind of constrained, it's a clinical interview, you really, 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 really need to carefully think about what is present in your data. Because if you don't, you come up with results that look promising, but are ultimately not meaningful because they're not representative of how speech changes. They're representative of what a clinical interview sounds like. And so we decided to put our segmentation back in, and found that actually the only way we really could improve classification for depression was when we did something called subject normalization. Subject normalization is the process of creating features, these short-time measurements, that are centered at 0 for each person. So each person has a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. Now the nice thing about that is it allows people to be comparable because everybody's baseline is 0. And so it creates models that could work with features more naturally. But The challenge of doing something like this is that it requires an understanding of which data that you should use to actually normalize. Do you normalize over the entirety of somebody's data? Do you only normalize when somebody's in a healthy state? Do you only normalize when someone's in a depressed or manic state? It can become very, very challenging to make this decision correctly, and the implications of doing it incorrectly really are decreases in your classification performance. And so we wanted to think about, well, how could we structure this idea of personalization, this idea of adaptation, in a way that would be kind of more in line with how speech is normally modeled? And so we started doing something called personalization. And this was the process of attempting to improve our prediction for depression. I'll cover this one at a high level. But what we did was we borrowed insight both from our clinicians and from other researchers in speech. Now, our clinicians always told us that when somebody was healthy, they sounded like themselves, and when they didn't, they sounded less like themselves, or the idea of you can hear it in their voice when they were beginning to have an episode oncoming. And we said, well, there's techniques in speech to do that. Speech biometrics are essentially trying to say, you sound like you, or you sound like somebody else. And so we use these techniques, something called identity vectors, or I vectors, as a way of encoding this information into our models, and found that for the first time, we can have statistically significant improvement. Now, between these two studies, the initial ones in speech rhythm and personalization, we thought, oh, fabulous, we're on a roll again. This will be just great. So then 2 years went by, and we realized that something else was needed. More specifically, a postdoc, Sohail Khorram, who was working with us, came to us and said, oh my gosh, we've been working with these data for 2 years. There is so much variability present, and we are not finding any signal outside of these extremely constrained environments, which were the clinical assessment calls. Anytime we got into the personal calls, our accuracy dropped down to chance again. Again, it's not very exciting. And so we started talking to our clinicians and saying, okay, we need to label something. What can we label? Now, labeling mood over short time scales isn't really something you could do because it's not really how people think about understanding symptom severity. There's not really 2 seconds within a 20-minute call that you'd say, that right there is manic. I mean, if someone's very, very extreme in their symptoms, it might be more true, but in general, that's just not how we think about illness. And so our clinicians said, you know what? Something that does change is someone's emotion expression patterns. Because fundamentally, bipolar disorder is a disorder of emotion dysregulation. And we said, fabulous, emotion, that's exactly what we also work on. And so we started thinking about how we can create a subset of our data that would be annotated for emotion, that would be labeled for emotion, that we can use to start to bridge the gap between between speech, which has very time-varying properties, and mood, which varies more slowly. And so that's what we did. So we wanted to try to figure out how to take speech content, which varies at the millisecond level, and map to moods, which varies over hours, days, and weeks. Very challenging. And so we wanted to simplify the process by finding an intermediary step whose variation is somewhere in between the milliseconds that come from natural speech acoustics and days to weeks to even months that come from mood. We wanted to simplify an intermediary step. And so emotion is what we started to think about. And this was a paper that was published in 2018. Now, we had at that time 4,000 hours of speech. Although we would love to annotate 4,000 hours of speech, it's really not within the realm of possibility within academia. Plus, not all of our subjects consented to have us listen to their data. But 12 out of the 51 did. They said, yes, you can listen not only to our assessment calls, but to the calls that occur outside of this assessment context. To be very clear, again, we take privacy very seriously. And so we chose our set of 12 subjects and then segmented the data to arrive not at calls now, so not taking an entire call, but sub-segments, which would vary between 3 and 30 seconds. And our goal was to come up with a single label that would characterize the emotion content that was present in each of those 3 to 30 second segments. The labels that we were concerned with were valence, which was positive versus negative, and activation, calm versus excited. Now, to do this, though, we couldn't use all the segments, again, partially because there were way too many. I think initially, I didn't write down, oh no, I did. We had 11,000 calls and 928 hours of speech. So annotating the full 167,000 segments that resulted really wasn't going to be something that we could do. And so we wanted to do something intelligent because we wanted to make sure we were getting access to the data that would allow us to build the models that were as accurate as possible. And so we selectively and randomly selected segments from assessment calls and the calls that occur on the day of assessment. Those were our priorities. And they were because they were the ones that had the strongest association with the labels that we had, which were our clinical assessments. From there, we ensured that the segments didn't have personally identifying information. We also presented them out of order so that you couldn't listen to someone's personal conversations. So it was both the random selection and the out of order processing that allowed us to have better assertions of privacy. We also did all of the annotation in-house, again, to make this assertion of privacy. And then finally, we did the valence and activation labeling, which gave us about, when we were doing this study, about 25 hours of speech, about 13,000 segments. The valence and activation labels were from a 9-point Likert scale, going from low in the case of valence would be negative versus positive, in the case of activation, calm versus excited. We had 11 annotators, 7 female, 4 males, all of whom were between 21 and 34, and they were native speakers of English. Very specifically, we asked our annotators to consider 2 things. 1, the acoustic characteristics and not the content. Although now we focus more on the lexical content of speech, at the time we were purely acoustics. We also asked them to specify for a given subject. So an annotator would listen to the entirety of a single subject's data out of order before moving on to the next subject, so they would get used to the emotion expression patterns for a given individual. That gave us a chart that looked kind of like this. Well, exactly like this. You can see that in that their natural speech, they're mostly concentrated at the origin. People are neutral or non-emotional a lot of the time, which, in certain data sets, you can always tell in active data sets because the distribution is much wider. But when you start thinking about natural speech, that's sort of the reality. The majority of our utterances were annotated by 4 annotators. And the average number of evaluations per was about 3.8. So then our question was, how can we use these data to actually build an emotion recognition system? So first thing we did was transform our annotations so that they're in line with what deep learning works well with, which is scaling from a range to -1 to 1. We then did something called subject-independent cross-validation. And this was to ensure that our models were trained and validated or tuned on a different set than they would eventually be tested on. And this was to ensure that our models were as population general or non-person specific as possible. It gives us a greater assurance that when we go to deploy our models, they'll actually work. They're not just capturing kind of spurious correlations within a single person or relevant personality characteristics. We did parameter selection using a concordance correlation coefficient over the validation set. So our test sets were fully held out. Now, normally what I present was the other model that we also tested this against, but in this case I'm actually going to present the model that works well because I'm going to take this model and show what else you can do with this afterwards. So our model took in speech features, speech signal, extracted input features. The input features here are something called MEL filter banks, and these are designed with human hearing in mind, so they have increasingly wide bands as the frequency content increases. So we took in these input features, and then we performed a series of convolutions using 256 different kernels. This gave us a time-continuous set of signals, 256 time-continuous signals. We then took the max over each one of these and then put these into another deep set of deep layers, which would allow us to predict the final valence and activation. And what we found is that the activation was correlated with the human labels at about 0.7, which was exciting, and that valence was predictably correlated lower than activation at about 0.4. I say predictably because there have been numerous studies that have shown that if you want to estimate the positivity in somebody's voice, you really need to have things like text or someone's face. Acoustics are great for the level of energy, but the level of positivity generally requires something else. So then we wanted to understand what emotion recognition could actually enable. And so the way we were going to do that initially, the way we did do that initially, was think about the association between emotion and mood. It's a way of grounding the fact that our emotion measures were doing things that were useful. And so we broke the data into 3 categories. Euthymia, which was below 6 on both the clinical, the Hamilton Depression Scale and the Young Mania Rating Scale. And if it was below 10 or above 10 on one scale, for example, the Hamilton Depression Scale, below 10 on the other, we said this would constitute depression. And above 10 on the Young Mania Rating Scale, below 10 on Hamilton Depression would constitute mania. And the reason why we've avoided the mixed states for now is that it introduces additional ambiguity, and whenever you're working in problems that are already inherently ambiguous, it makes sense to identify the signal and then chase it as hard as you can, increasing the ambiguity at each stage. So we started here. We then wanted to try to figure out how people's emotions vary around their own baselines. So we are going to consider euthymia as the baseline, euthymia the healthy state as the baseline, and use this to normalize the emotion patterns that occur both in depression and in mania. And then we wanted to use that the network I was just talking about to predict our emotion across all of the calls, all of the clinical assessment calls. These are still clinical assessments. And then we wanted to associate the measures with depression and mania. We did this over all 10,000 of the assessment call segments now, not just the labeled ones. And we found something really interesting. So we found that mood and emotion were linked, which although we know that clinically, it's also important to be able to show that you can actually pick up on that algorithmically. We found that balance and activation were significantly higher in manic versus depressed episodes. That means in a manic episode, someone was more positive and more excited than they were in a depression episode where they were less positive, less excited. We also found that the severity of mania and the severity of depression were correlated with the level of positivity and the level of excitement. So as someone became more and more mania, they experienced more and more manic symptoms, their level of positivity, the level of energy increased. As they became more and more depressed, the level of negativity, the level of calmness also increased. So we saw that these measures were correlated. And that was really exciting because it meant that not only can we estimate emotion accurately in these calls, but we can also associate those patterns of emotion with things that matter. And so now we had our thread that we were chasing. And our thread told us that emotion and mood are related. What if we could make emotion recognition systems even more accurate? What if we can increase the accuracy of our emotion predictions? What could we do next? Because again, speech is really complex. And so we know that emotion is a big data problem, or at least I'm asserting that emotion is a big data problem. The question is, how can you create algorithms that will allow us to translate paralinguistic or information above the linguistics from data sets that have certain properties to data sets that have other properties? How can we make our algorithms robust and generalizable? How can we make our algorithms work in places where they haven't seen large amounts of labeled data? Because if we can do that, then we can use these algorithms to do things that are really powerful. And so we wanted to do something called domain generalization. And the idea here is that you're creating some kind of a middle ground representation so that a data set that has a representation in one space and a data set that has a representation in another space can somehow be made to look more similar so that the models are able to sort of talk across data sets, talk across the places in which they operate. And the reason why it's so hard is the same reason why speech is hard. Because data sets encode all sorts of types of variations. And if you're not controlling for this, then you can be picking up on these spurious correlations, these correlations that don't actually encode what you think they do. And actually, I'm going to do a little aside because I think this is such a potent example. There was a challenge in our field a few years ago. And people were asked to detect whether or not a given kid was likely to have a diagnosis of autism or was likely to be typically developing. And people were finding these amazing findings. They can get from 10 seconds of speech, they can get somewhere up in the order of about 90-something% accuracy, which seems unlikely, right? Because a human clinician must take more than 10 seconds of speech. And a lot of patterns aren't really expressed over those time scales. And what someone found was that that's not actually what the algorithms were doing. They weren't classifying the behavior of the kids with autism. What they were doing was classifying the silence because the data sets were recorded in 2 separate places. And so if one of the rooms, I can't remember the exact acoustic conditions were, but if one of the rooms has a fan and the other room does not have a fan, then your acoustic data will pick up on that information. And if you're not careful with how you're controlling for it, you'll be able to do a really good job because you've got background noise. Now that's a problem And that's exactly the type of thing that you're trying to avoid when you're trying to create these cross-data set algorithms, things that will be robust to those types of variations. And there have been many approaches that have looked at how you can do domain generalization. There have been efforts in thinking about audio encoders, how you can kind of tease apart the different sources of noise. There have been methods that have been looking at how you essentially can unlearn some aspect of the data set while still retaining your ability to do this classification. But something that we found again and again and again is that these models weren't working for emotion. We weren't able to sort of stably learn a system that was able to do this type of generalization. The models weren't converging. And so we couldn't use this very traditional approach of domain adversarial neural networks. Because although their goal is exactly what I said, which is to generate some kind of middle representation, while still being able to classify emotion, we found that our models didn't really know what it meant to unlearn a domain. What does that actually mean? Does it mean the people in it? Does it mean recording conditions? And actually my student John, who did this work, had the best example. If I tell you to not think about an elephant, that's not a very helpful visualization. And so what his goal was to do is think about how you can create an algorithm that is told to do something else, so that it can still create a middle ground representation, but one that's actually encoding the information you care about and one that has a target for learning so that will actually converge. So what if we can still be discriminative and we had a clear target? And so the idea of the overview is to generate a representation based on the audio data, one that can still do emotion classification, but also one that has a domain critic. And the goal of the domain critic was to say, okay, I have a representation that I've gained from these two different data sets. And if they're far away from each other, that's bad. If they're closer to each other, that's better. So I want to backpropagate the difference between my data sets as a way of telling my algorithms they should iteratively become closer and closer and closer to each other. So we took the baseline system that's actually quite similar to the one that I was talking about earlier. And so it has the feature encoder, which is just the input MFBs, again, the same speech features we had previously. We had a convolutional layer, another convolutional layer, again, the same kind of global max pooling to get the single values. And then we have emotion classification. So the representation is then fed into just a standard neural network. And that's the vanilla version. We also had a domain critic version. And the domain critic version was trying to minimize the Earth mover's distance, the dissimilarity, between the representations that are generated from two separate data sets. If those two representations look closer to each other, then that was good. If they were farther apart, that was bad. And to clarify, just to make it a little bit more clear how you'd actually train these things, you train them one at a time. So you train the emotion representation, then you train the critic, then you train the emotion representation, then you train the critic. You do this iteratively until the networks converge or until you decide to stop training. Now this gives you the ability to look at the difference between, or to control for the difference between two data sets, but Mad Dog, the multi-class Mad Dog, was the version that allowed us to take multiple data sets into account. So how can I create a representation that allows me to speak across two data sets, and another representation that speaks across another two data sets? How can I create these multiple pairs that will allow me to have a more robust description of what emotion actually looks like? And so we found that this model was pretty effective. We did a bunch of tests. Again, I'm kind of trying to step through this stuff quickly to get to the story part. So rather than tell you about all the different tests that we did, I'm going to just focus on this last little bit, where we trained on two laboratory collected data sets and then tested on that priori corpus that I was just talking about. And the thing we're hoping to see is that when we use this multi-class AdDog, the multi-class adversarial domain generalization framework, it would allow us to have a greater ability to recognize emotion in a setting it has not seen before, or a setting from which it only has a little bit of data. And so essentially our goal was to take these two very standard emotion recognition data sets, IE mocap and MSP, and use them to recognize emotion in our priori corpus. And just to be clear, so the x-axis is the amount of labeled data that we're taking from our priori corpus, and the y-axis is UAR, which is the way we always do this in emotion. It's unweighted average recall, and it's the average of the recall for each of the classes. And the reason we do this is it deals with data. It helps us deal with data sets that are unbalanced. And so the first thing that we did is we applied the traditional CNN. That's the one that I was starting off at the beginning, the simple vanilla CNN. And what this suggests, so it's a 3-class model, and this is performing at 0.36, so it's not awfully inspiring. What it tells us is that we can't just train a data set on we can't just train a model on data sets we've never seen it before, apply it blindly, and hope that it will work. It does not work. Then we wanted to understand, well, what happens if we bring in the additional functionality? So in this kind of yellowish color is the specialty purpose model. That says if we train the CNN on priori and test it on priori. So that's the conventional within data set testing. You see that it's better than CNN, as you would expect. In purple, you see AdDoc. So that's when you're using a model trained on a single laboratory collection and then tested on priori. And then in the dark orange, what you're seeing is the MadDog system, the one that is trained on 2 laboratory data sets and tested on priori. Now the dots here are showing that all 3 of these are significantly worse than this multi-class AdDog, the MadDog method. And so what that's telling us is that through careful algorithmic design, it's possible to develop a system that's actually capable of recognizing emotion in this way. And it matters. It matters because if we can robustly detect emotion, what can we do next? Well, what we can do is something that really, really, really matters. Emotion detection is important, not only for bipolar disorder, but also for suicidality. In 2017, there were 47,000 deaths due to suicide. And it's an incredibly challenging public health problem because often the last conversation that someone who has committed suicide will say is, or the last thing they'll say in a conversation is, I'm not going to commit suicide. And even human clinicians are only about 50-50 in their ability to say if someone's going to commit suicide in the near future. And so we need some other way of estimating risk, some other way of trying to understand when you might have a just-in-time intervention so that you can save lives. Now, we know that speech is a promising signal. There's been a lot of research in the space, but the challenging aspect, much like we've seen throughout this, is that suicidality, thoughts of suicide, vary much more slowly than the low-level acoustics. And when you start talking about data that are about anything, that are collected anywhere in the world, then you need to have some way of controlling for variability so that you can pick up on the signals that you actually care about. And so what we wanted to look at was how, again, much like in the last section, we can use emotion as that intermediary. And so we used priori to collect a new data set, and it was called the Ecological Measurement of Affect, Speech, and Suicide, and it was collected with our collaborators at Butler Hospital, which is associated with Brown. Right now, it involved, well, actually, when we submitted this work, there were 43 individuals who were enrolled for 8 weeks each, and they were divided into 4 groups: healthy controls, psychiatric controls, suicidal ideation group, and suicidal attempts. Now, the suicide attempt and ideation groups were admitted to the hospital with a suicide ideation or attempt within the last month. Psychiatric controls were admitted to the hospital for other reasons than suicide, often for substance abuse, and then the healthy controls were healthy controls. Now, the only addition that we have here compared to the priori app that we talked about previously is now we're using a mobile EMA survey as well. And the mobile EMA is a way of asking 3 times a day, what are your emotions? What are your emotions? What are your emotions? We also asked about stress. And this allowed us to get some kind of a grounding for what emotions people were actually experiencing as they went throughout their lives. And this allowed us to have this distribution. So we had a total of 402 hours. We're actually over 500 now. We had 19 subjects in the healthy control group, 12 in the suicidal ideation, 4 in psychiatric control, and 4 in suicide attempts. And so our question then was to think about how can we estimate the emotion that's present in a given survey using only the speech from these natural smartphone calls. We aren't using any of the clinical assessments like we did in the previous section. All of these are just natural speech samples as someone goes out throughout their day. So we wanted to think about how these 2 things are related. So, the challenge here is that unlike in our priori corpus, we couldn't just listen to everything and annotate it. We needed to do everything in an unsupervised way. We needed to do all of our assessments without first double checking that the assessment, or that our ability to predict these emotion labels is actually correct. And so what we did is we took that MadDog method that I just talked about, that we had just validated on priori emotion, and said, I don't know, maybe we can use those Mad Dog models as a way of generating a secondary set of features that we could then use to predict the emotion state that's present in those survey calls. We can estimate the emotion from the estimates of emotion. And so the input were these are the segment features are the priority estimates the Mad Dog estimates that we got using the model I just talked about. Then we have a set of layers that allow us to predict low versus high emotion for a set of 11 categories. What we found, I'm going to skip a little bit of the details. What we found is that across the 11 categories, these were categories that were suggested by our collaborators, we could actually recognize 8 of the 11 at rates above 0.6 AUC. And again, this is purely natural speech that we cannot listen to. Even more exciting though, is this category down here that includes anger at others, anger itself, and irritability. All 3 of these categories are categories whose variation are tied to risk of suicide, and the fact that we're able to estimate them automatically really points to future ability to really be able to do something. But we wanted to figure out what else this would enable. And so we extracted those 8 emotions, all of the 8 that were above a 0.6. And for each person, we created a bag. So for example, the anger at others bag. That would be all of the segments that someone had from the data set with the estimates of anger at others estimated. That set of continuous measures. We did this for each of the 11 motions. So we would have confident, hopeless, anger at others, anger itself, etc. Each of these is a bag of emotions that is a set of continuous estimates from our system. Then what we did is calculate the standard deviation of each of those bags and look at how they differ between people who are healthy controls and people at risk for suicide. What we found was that in 5 of the categories, the standard deviation of the individuals in the suicidal ideation group was statistically significantly lower than those in the healthy control group. And this is really interesting. It's interesting because it allows us to differentiate between the 2 groups at about 0.8. But the other reason it's interesting is that research groups are finding these types of results again and again and again, which is that it's the standard deviation, it's the variance that matters. That's what's really allowing us to really understand the differences between these 2 groups. But the reason why we're excited is that this is taking data for which we have 0 control, other than the fact they're on a cell phone, and allowing us to do something that really, in the end, might significantly impact people's lives. Measurement tool used to understand mental health, exactly. And so in conclusion, what we found is that we actually can detect self-rated emotion in natural speech. The Mad Dog system not only is a cross-domain, but allows us to pull out measurements that matter. And that we've been able to establish a link between lower emotion variability and individuals with suicidal ideation. The collection is ongoing and includes other surveys, and we're moving towards thinking about other disorders as well. But really what it points to is that not only is speech extremely complex, but we might have ways of addressing the complexity to do things that really matter. So thanks, I'd be happy to take any questions.
So I usually collect their questions like 10 minutes ago, and I got so caught up in we were talking about them, so I haven't read them. So first of all, thank you. And second of all, you all are going to have to actually ask questions directly since I haven't parsed out your cards. So go ahead, Luke.
So if you were to make a prediction on a novel patient or participant, about how much novel data would you need to feel comfortable in the prediction?
That's a really great question, and it depends entirely on what we're trying to predict. So in this case, when we're doing these predictions, all of these are essentially novel patients because the models to, I mean in one sense, the models to predict the balance and activation are trained on someone totally different. And in all of these cases, the secondary emotion classification are all subject independent. And so we always treat our subjects as never before seen. So in this case, it's more how much data do we need to train the system than how much data do we need to actually test it. The one case where that's different is the work that's in submission, which is the reason why I'm not really talking about it. In that case, we were interested in thinking about how we can understand what interventions are needed by essentially doing anomaly detection, of thinking about how someone's baseline mood varies over time and then how deviations from that moving baseline might suggest need for intervention. In that case, we found about 2 months worth of data was what we needed to have stable performance.
Do you know if there's significance, or have you tested for any significance between like the background of the person to their emotion, and if the person was rich, or what community they came from, and what like information they had?
Yeah, that's interesting. So we haven't looked at demographics in that sense yet, looking at socioeconomic status, which I think would be really, really interesting. We also haven't yet looked at culture as a factor, or the language that people are speaking, but we do have collections ongoing that are starting to address these things. The thing that we're really interested in thinking about that we also haven't had a chance to do yet focuses on temperament also. So if someone has personality characteristics that are a bit more irritable, then what does that mean for our ability to recognize their mood, or for someone who's more of an extrovert versus introvert, et cetera. But yeah, I think that all these personality factors, everything goes into how we express ourselves.
So to follow up, wouldn't that to some extent be captured by normalization?
Yeah, to some extent it'll be captured by normalization. But if we start to think about like tonal languages, where the underlying acoustics are also going to be fundamentally affected, then the deviations that one can expect are going to be different, and then the time series properties are going to be different as well. And so I think there are maybe normalization techniques that you can apply directly, but even so, the culture in which we're raised will affect how we actually express our emotions and the largeness with which we express our emotions. There's interesting work that's looking at emotion expression patterns in the US versus in other countries. And in the US, we tend to have much larger expressions of emotion. And so that will also play into our ability. And so I think in order to be able to do this robustly, you either need to have so much data such that these variations are encoded in the data themselves, or you need to have strong ways of handling those types of variation, which actually we're starting to think about a bit.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but your model right now is based mostly off of phone calls and both personal and also your clinical interviews. Do you think that your modeling could work if it's a continuous data collection, like you just mic up someone over the course of a day and collect your interactions and your conversations without having it be a structured like phone call, or based off of just a continuous conversation?
We're working on that now, so I'll get back to you in about 2 years. Yeah.
Very.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know, it's hard to say. I'm hopeful that the answer will be yes. We've demonstrated that the models are pretty robust to a lot of types of variation, and so I'm extremely interested, because if you can avoid the need to have any constraints over people's behavior and just allow them to operate in their world, then not only do you get to learn more about illness, but you just get to learn about behavior and how it relates to so many different outcomes, which is exactly what we're working on now. We actually had a kickoff for that project this morning, actually. Really working on it now.
Okay, I'll ask you to maybe stay for a few minutes if someone has a one-on-one question or a little too shy to raise their hand, but let's formally stop so you can start your project work, and thank you again.